Previously on Rocket War.
The government of the United States of America has initiated a multinational military effort to deter Iraqi aggression. The government of Canada has decided, therefore, to dispatch 3 ships of the Canadian forces to the Persian Gulf.
The media were pretty good about bringing instant pictures of what was happening in the Gulf back home.
And I remember thinking, all these poor wives are going to be home. A few men, of course, would be home as their wives were being deployed, and all these little children worrying, is mommy going to come back? Is daddy going to come back?
We've got one of our ships has been hit by a mine off Kuwait City.
We all were thinking it, but we weren't saying it. Because I'll tell you right now, we were scared shitless.
From Knockabout Media, I'm Ryan Barnett, and this is Rocket War, a new series exploring Canada's role in the Persian Gulf War. In our last episode, we looked at how Canada went to war by sea. But our response to the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait wasn't limited to our Navy. Today we explore the air war over the Middle East through a Canadian lens, what it meant to deploy to the Persian Gulf as members of the Royal Canadian Air Force. This is Episode 2, Scramble Order.
The Canadian House of Commons met on Monday for the first time since Iraq invaded Kuwait in early August. Coming up next on C-SPAN, we take you to Ottawa for a portion of this session concerning events in the Persian Gulf from the Canadian House of Commons.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker.
The second, without provocation or warning, Iraq invaded Kuwait. Having overrun his smaller neighbor, Saddam Hussein claimed that Kuwaiti territory henceforth belonged to Iraq. Although he said that he had no further territorial ambitions, such assurances had been heard before. 52 years ago this month in Munich, the world learned a hard lesson about aggression and appeasement.
On September 14, 1990, as HMSC Athabaskan, Terra Nova, and Protector, the 3 Canadian ships, sailed toward the Persian Gulf, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney announced an additional contribution to the coalition campaign.
Canada also decided to send some air forces to the Gulf.
This is Canadian Infantry Officer Jean Morin. Morin deployed to the Gulf as the operations official historian. In that announcement, Prime Minister Mulroney committed 16 CF-18 Hornet fighter jets to the effort.
The CF-18s that were tasked to go to the Gulf came from our NATO forces in Germany.
At this time, as the Cold War was coming to a close, Canada had both an Army Brigade and an Air Division stationed in West Germany as part of NATO's forces in the region. They were there to defend Western Europe from Soviet aggression, or, to put a finer point on it,
its purpose was to basically, kill anything that moved that came down Highway 6 from Czechoslovakia. And if they weren't coming, then to deter them through aggressive training activity.
That's Dr. Sean Maloney.
I was the historian for 4 Canadian Mechanized Brigade in Germany at the end of the Cold War and right after the Gulf War.
So, at this point you might be a little confused. If the Canadian forces stationed in West Germany were that important, then why were they sent to the Arabian Desert to mediate what amounted to a regional oil dispute gone bad? Was the oil that important to Canada?
Let's just push aside this idea that this is all blood for oil stuff. I don't think that was part of the calculation. I think part of the calculation was we are in the post-Cold War environment. The UN is asserting itself against a dictator.
Saddam Hussein.
We're going to contribute to it, but we're going to contribute to it minimally. That's the thinking. That's the impression I had at the time.
The invasion of Kuwait was seen for exactly what it was: a brutal aggression, a flagrant violation of international law, and a challenge to the principles of the international order on which world peace depends.
This is Prime Minister Mulroney addressing the House of Commons on September 24th, 1990.
That idea, created out of the rubble of World War II, was one of peace through collective strength. That idea was that a civilized world community living by a common code of behavior would have the will to stand up to tyranny and the means to respond to it. That idea was the United Nations.
And then, of course, one of the reasons that Canada gets involved in peacekeeping is to distance itself from the U.S., or at least certain factions.
The factions, as Sean calls them, sought to use UN peacekeeping missions as a way to distinguish Canada's international presence from that of the United States. It was also believed that peacekeeping was a good way to involve the military in world affairs without risking bloody and unpopular combat operations.
So that's 1990, and the Canadian government has jumped on, at that point, every single UN operation going.
Cambodia, Congo, Egypt, Cyprus, Syria. Canadians and UN Blue Berets were everywhere.
And then all of a sudden, we're in a situation where the UN is authorizing a real live war to liberate Kuwait. And so there are arguments against being heavily involved in this.
And why?
It's risk averse at its worst. We're going to commit to this thing, but we're completely risk averse.
In addition to logistical issues, risk aversion kept the government from sending the Army Brigade stationed in Germany to the Gulf.
There are people that are cranking up the casualty figures and scaring the Privy Council because Saddam's chem capability was extant in the 80s.
Saddam Hussein had a reputation for using chemical weapons. In fact, during the Iran-Iraq War, tens of thousands of Iranian soldiers and civilians were killed and maimed by chemical weapons. Hussein killed thousands of civilians, especially Kurds.
And, Canada's going to lose troops to Saddam's chem if we get anywhere near Iraq.
Estimates of how many Canadian soldiers would be lost were significant. Planners figured that within 30 days, 1,000 to 3,000 Canadian soldiers would die, and 3,500 to 7,500 would be wounded. In short, they thought that the 9,000 soldier brigade would need to be totally replaced after a month of fighting.
So this is the sort of stuff that I hear is going on.
So it was decided that the best course of action was to send in the Air Force to support the Navy's interdiction operations. But before they could support the ships, they would first have to make it safely to the Persian Gulf.
We left Germany the day prior, stayed overnight on the way down, as I said, in Cyprus.
This is Captain Paul Pitch Molnar. Paul was a fighter pilot and part of the first group of Canadian fighter jets sent to the Gulf in the fall of 1990.
As we were working our way south, it's more humid, it's hotter.
Paul remembers that trip from Germany to Qatar, the changing landscape seen from the cockpit of his jet.
We went over Saudi Arabia, Egypt, obviously lots of water with the Persian Gulf on our way in, and a clear blue, beautiful area. Not a lot of built-up areas, a lot of desert, of course. And we landed in Doha sort of mid-afternoon, very hot day. It was 50, 55 Celsius, somewhere in that order of temperature.
The 16 CF-18 Hornets arrived in Doha, Qatar on the 12th of October, ready to begin their mission.
We were welcomed by our ground crew who had already flown in on C-130 Hercules. Canada was a bit of a late commit to this role, so we had no place to stay except for in a 4- or 5-star hotel overlooking the Gulf, which was quite nice, to be honest. But mind you, we'd have at least 4 people in a 1-bedroom suite.
Cramped as their temporary quarters were, the pilots weren't concerned with where they'd hang their hats at the end of the day. Mission focused, they were there to provide air cover against anti-ship missiles and Iraqi patrol boats. This practice was known as a combat air patrol, or CAP.
I landed on the 10th. My first CAP looks like it was on the 16th. We were doing these Whiskey 1, Whiskey 2 CAPs, which are based on how far north they were.
As the Canadian fighters patrolled the zones over the Gulf, designated Whiskey 1 and Whiskey 2, the rest of the coalition built up its presence in Qatar.
It was, at least 2 to 3 weeks. I think we were in the hotel. And then by that time, I think the logistics had been worked out. And then what materialized quite quickly was called Canada Dry 1 and Canada Dry 2.
The Canada Dry camps were much more like military bases: barbed wire, tents, sandbags, and armed guards. Canada Dry 1 was the main logistical base for the Canadians.
What it was an abandoned industrial site off base that they basically fortified with sandbags and, pretty much like a forward operating base.
Canada Dry 2 was a Canadian compound for pilots and aircrew on the nearby Coalition airbase, which was shared with Americans as well as personnel from other Coalition nations.
And we had a contingent of the Royal Canadian Regiment that actually was our protective force, which is pretty cool because, you've got warriors that are going to protect you while you sleep. So that was amazing.
And there weren't just armed guards on the Canadian base. Many different people with varying skill sets were required to ensure that the base operated properly.
The first technician went down for about 6 weeks, but then had to come back for a personal situation in, I believe it was November 1990. And so I was the next up.
Master Corporal Donald McPherson was a communications system technician assigned to work on the Canada Dry bases. Donald recalls that first day on the base.
I got down there, he gave me a 5-minute handover and went back on the plane I came in on. So
Deposited in the Qatari desert, Donald's job was to ensure clear lines of communication over the radio.
We had several networks for the aircraft maintainers, the military police. I think there were 6 networks around the airfield for various supporting roles.
Donald and his team had their hands full.
Vehicle radios, the handheld portables, and the base stations for those networks. The people that work around the aircraft, of course, needed to be able to communicate so that they're in the right place to do the right thing and get information back and forth.
The biggest threat to communications on the bases? Sand.
I would often go and to fix a radio, and while I'm there, I'd fix 6 or 7 other problems because people would see the tech there and go, oh, this one, by the way, it's all scratchy now.
But Donald always arrived armed.
I was going through little spray cans of compressed air like nobody's business, just to blow the crud out of the radios and get them working again.
In addition to compressed air canisters, rubbing alcohol was required to clean the equipment. However,
in a Muslim country, oh my God, what a hassle to get alcohol.
Some tools Donald could get from local shops, but the sale of alcohol was banned regardless of its purpose. So Donald had to rely on the military supply system and a little creative thinking.
The best solution they could find for me was to buy medical grade alcohol. So the medics would order extra, they'd get it, and then I'd use some of this. And it's not optimal. It does leave a little bit of a coating behind and everything else, but we made it work.
So we were feet wet, straight out of Doha, go up the Gulf, go on cap.
This again is Paul Molnar. Paul recalls those early days of the conflict before the January bombing campaign.
But you'd be cruising back along Saudi Arabia. So you've got Saudi to the west, you've got Iran to the east.
And while those patrols were relatively calm, they weren't uneventful.
We did have surface-to-air missile sites that we would be in proximity to that were looking at us.
Paul remembers one encounter with the Iranian forces across the Gulf.
Iran wasn't directly involved, so we weren't going to go and send anything in or have our allies go in and take out sites. But it was tickling us, if you will, as we went north. There were some assets from other countries. So the Russians, who are well-known allies, had some of their aircraft there. So we did have a couple interesting intercepts and or almost engagements with them.
I served in the Gulf War roughly mid-November, right to the very end of the campaign.
This is Captain David Deere. David was among the pilots rotated into the Gulf following Paul Molnar.
And we were initially starting the combat air patrol over the Gulf, so the high-value assets. And of interest for me was one of those high-value assets was my brother.
Many Canadians were exchange posted with British and American forces during the war, meaning that they were Canadian Forces members sent to work with foreign units. David's brother, Lieutenant Commander Chris Deere, was one of them. He was 30,000 feet below David, stationed on board the British minesweeper HMS Dulverton.
So it was quite an interesting combination, true brothers in arms.
As the early winter months dragged on, the United Nations grew increasingly impatient with Saddam Hussein. The trade embargoes were not having the desired effects, and Iraqi forces still occupied Kuwait. The UN Security Council would eventually pass a resolution allowing the American-led coalition to use force against Iraq if they did not withdraw troops from Kuwait before a January 15, 1991 deadline. The pressure was on. It was Iraq's final opportunity to avoid all-out war.
The positions of our air patrol slowly progressed closer and closer to the enemy line, and then eventually right into Iraq. And then we did progress into more offensive roles.
The January 15th deadline came and went, but Iraqi forces showed no indication that they would evacuate Kuwait without a fight. In the early morning hours of January 17th, coalition fighters, bombers, and helicopters roared to life on airstrips around the region. The bombing campaign had begun. Coalition aircraft flew into Iraq and Kuwait, targeting enemy air defenses and destroying the trenches and bunkers the Iraqi army had meticulously constructed over the previous several months. The campaign wedged open a path for an incoming ground invasion of the area. Canadian planes weren't initially among those involved. Parliament still needed to approve participation in this new type of operation. The government's reluctance frustrated some pilots. Here again is Paul Molnar.
There was a lot of denial as to what we were capable of. They called us defensive only. I think there was some back and forth. We can be defensive till the cows come home, but at the end of the day, we were capable of doing everything that the coalition needed, and we weren't going to be used for that. So that was a bit frustrating.
4 days into the operation, the Canadians were cleared to take part. They began flying sweep and escort missions, clearing Iraqi defenses for the coalition bombers. David Deere was among the pilots to fly these missions.
As I look at my logbook, I can see the very first one. It says, offensive sweep escort with 4 British Tornadoes, 2 Buccaneers, 3 American EF-111s, and 2 Wild Weasels. And the target was an airfield 60 miles east of Baghdad.
Good evening, I'm David French in Washington. The chair I'm sitting in is a cherished one. It's the anchor position for Bernard Shaw. Bernie and John Holloman, our correspondents who told you first of this war and then stayed up all through that night and that intrepid day, are now in Amman, Jordan, getting ready to come on here and talk with us. The bombing of Baghdad as they were leaving and spent that awful night looked something like this. This is the videotape of what they were seeing out their hotel window that night, courtesy of ABC.
Of course, it was a CNN war.
The nascent 24-hour news cycle would broadcast the bombing campaign live for the world to watch.
We'd be by the airfield and we'd watch our fighters take off. Then we'd go and have a snack somewhere and then sit in the common room watching CNN to see how they were doing at the other end. When the attack faded out and they started repeating and showing the recaps, we'd go back and get everything ready and then drive back to the airfield because we knew our aircraft would be coming back. So,
among the hundreds of planes flying feverishly around the Gulf were supply planes.
We were flying an average. The crew day was maximized to wartime, so we were allowed to be in for 20 hours. A short day was 18 hours, so we were really tired.
This is Claude Saint-Onge. Claude served as a loadmaster on one of the numerous C-130 Hercules aircraft transporting military equipment to the Gulf. As a loadmaster, Claude was tasked with the safe loading and unloading of this much-needed cargo.
We went to Doha, Bahrain, to drop our load where the CF-18 were and we were actually resupplying the CF-18 with all the material they needed and the troops there. And we carried 2,000-pound bombs, which we had about 30,000-pound load on the aircraft.
Claude and his crew worked through the grueling 20-hour days with a mix of determination and humor.
And all that to bring it to Bahrain or Doha, and then to put 2 under a CF-18 to be dropped in the desert. But the joke was we should divert and drop the whole load at one time from the Hercules. That would have done a big hole, you know.
A month and a half of coalition bombing eventually wore down the Iraqi defenses, but it took a lot of supplies. During the campaign, a staggering 88,500 tons of coalition bombs were dropped. Getting that many bombs into the theater took a lot of planes.
I looked left, there was an airplane. I looked right, there was one. Above, there was one. Below us, it was like just about a 1,500 feet separation. We had Americans with their big plane, the CF-5, the Galaxy Starlifter. We had other nation. They deployed all the aircraft we had in the system. We had about 33. They deployed 30.
Complicating matters, this was not a new fleet.
You got to remember that these airplanes were almost 40 years old.
Often, Claude's plane would start to lose air pressure, and it was his job to find the leak mid-flight.
So I would smoke a cigar, look around, see where the smoke would go. And most of the time was the hatch, the upper hatch, which was there was a little crack there.
And how do you fix a leaky hatch while flying miles above the desert?
Then we used to put wet paper towel to plug in the hole.
Losing air pressure wasn't the only safety threat to Claude's aircrew. The CNN War would introduce the viewing public to a more explosive threat.
Well, Cheryl, it was almost exactly 2 hours ago when the sirens went off here in Saudi Arabia. Where we are in eastern Saudi Arabia, there was no problem. However, the Saudi military says there were 2 incoming Scud missiles intercepted by Patriot missiles arcing into the night sky over the Saudi capital.
Like bazookas and Uzis before, the Scud missile entered the common household lexicon in 1991. These were massive, long-range, Soviet-designed rockets made to strike deep into enemy territory.
Saddam Hussein had some voluminous rockets at that time, and that those Scuds might be loaded with large explosive or with biological or chemical weapons.
When they were launching weapons, people would have a Scud that wasn't even close to its target, hit in a field a couple miles away or something.
Scud's a stupid missile. It's a stupid missile, right?
I think only half the Scuds that we were alerted for even hit the country we were in.
Well, not the most accurate. When they struck their target, they were deadly. In February of 1991, a single Scud targeting a U.S. Army barracks in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, killed 28 soldiers and wounded hundreds more. One lone missile. Scuds also created a problem for coalition forces by impeding their ability to move equipment. When a Scud launch was detected from Iraq, a warning would go out and coalition troops would take shelter in bunkers.
When we landed in Doha once, and all the base was shut down, except one time one guy came, he said, we're all on the bunkers because there's a Scud attack.
There was no time to waste.
So we did what we call a hot offloading. I just lowered the ramp of the airplane, unlocked everything, and actually when we do that, the airplane moves forward and all the load comes out at the end. It's actually dropped right on the tarmac. Then we closed the ramp and took off back to Qatar.
Claude's crew made it out without getting hit by the Scud, but Claude was injured by the tons of equipment rolling out of the plane.
I was in the back and I got a little squeeze between the pallet and my back took quite a beating. And then after that I was sent back to Canada because of my back. I had actually cracked one of my vertebrae.
By the 24th of February 1991, the Iraqi defenses were weakened enough that it was now time for the ground invasion. Next time on Rocket War.
And all of a sudden, as we approached noon that day, the sky just started to get dark. And by 1 or 2 in the afternoon, it was like night.
They were destroying oil wells and setting them on fire.
I call it the COVID mask, right? The surgical mask. I took that off and I could wring it out with the amount of oil that was in that mask.
Rocket War is an original production of Knockabout Media, written by William Patterson and hosted and produced by me, Ryan Barnett. This podcast was made possible thanks to funding from Veterans Affairs Canada's Commemorative Partnership Program. It features original interviews with Tim Courtney, Harold Davis, David Deere, Chris Linford, Donald McPherson, Dr. Sean Maloney, Natasha Moore, Paul Molnar, Jean Morin, Claude Saint-Onge, and the Honorable Rebecca Patterson. Voice direction by Sonia Jamidi. Our series consultant is Jean Morin. If you enjoy this podcast, please rate and review as it helps people find the show. If you're an educator and want to incorporate this series into your classroom, we have a list of discussion questions that can be found in the show notes or downloaded from our website at knockaboutmedia.com. There you'll also find our other shows, which include Among Equals, The Black Hum, Story Girl, and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood North. Thanks for listening.
A Knockabout Media original. Hold on.